Welcome back to The Move, where I've been through the book 10 minutes at a time. I'm your host, Justin Koo, and in today's episode, we're talking about that one time in the Bible that God contradicts himself when he talks to Israel. If you're wondering what we're looking at, Genesis chapter 46, verses 1 through 27, hanging out with Pastor Ben Williams. Pastor Ben Williams, have you ever felt like God contradicts himself? Because that's kind of, it feels like that's a blasphemous thing to say about God, right? That he contradicts himself.
Yeah, there's times definitely where it seems like something he's telling me now is way different and maybe even contrary to something that he told me before. I can even just very quickly remember this time where God called me to do a specific thing one summer. And so I got there and it was great. And then like 2 weeks later, it really seemed like, and I still believe to this day, God actually called me to leave that place. And I was really struggling for a long time thinking, you literally told me to be here. And now that I'm here, you're telling me to leave and everyone's going to think I'm a phony, all these. Yeah. And then, I just had to settle, man, maybe God had me here for a reason and now it's time to go. And something was accomplished or not accomplished. And just because he's calling me to leave now doesn't mean that he didn't call me to be there in the first place.
Yes. And I think the tension there is that we've somehow imposed the need for God to be efficient from our perspective, right? Like, Why would you call me to that place if a week later, 2 weeks later, you're calling me away from that place? Wouldn't it just been more efficient to not call me there, just to send me to stage 2 right away? And yet that's not the case. I also have an experience like that. I felt very called to go to Philadelphia a number of years ago to help teach at a Bible school and to have that experience. And then, in my mind, that contract was going to last several years, but it ended up being like about half the time that I expected. And there was a huge pressure and maybe even a little bit of sense of guilt in leaving that station earlier than I anticipated, even though I still firmly believe that God was calling me away from that place. And why that's important for us today is because, we get to see Jacob. Jacob is someone who has been, at the later part of his life, from at least the narrative perspective, but for so long he has been laser focused on the promise of God and operating within the boundaries. He had some hiccups earlier, as we've all journeyed through in the last however many episodes, but later in his life, he's doing his best to be faithful. And now he hears the good news that his son is alive and there's an invitation to come to Egypt. Now, why exactly does that matter? Because he wasn't supposed to go there.
Yeah, and in chapter, I think it's 26, God explicitly tells him, do not go down to Egypt. And yet now he finds himself, his son is saying, hey, Dad, come see me. I'm alive, by the way. Also, just please, come and see me. And God comes to him and basically says, hey, I just want you to know it's all good for you to go. You actually should go. And it's, again, like you're saying, this contradictory moment. But I think it teaches us a lesson to always be listening to God.
Ooh.
For instance, if God has called you maybe not to go somewhere or to go somewhere, don't then not seek him when someone gives you a different call. I mean, let's say someone's God gives me a call to come to Maui in Hawaii. That does not mean I should not ask God where I should go next. If let's say Oklahoma hits me up and says, Ben, we want you to come be a pastor. I shouldn't be nope, God told me to be in Maui. I don't even need to ask him. The journey that we're on with God is progressive and it's changing and it's always forming and shifting. And maybe there's going to be a time where I think, no, God's already given me an answer on this. But when I go to him in the secret place and I say, God, what's the answer? He's going to be like, I did tell you that, but also now things are different and I want you to actually go.
I have friends that have wrestled through moments like this, and maybe it's not as clean cut as I received a new calling to the next church like that. But it's I thought God was leading in this romantic relationship. I thought God was blessing it. And now it seems like it's not working out. It's the two are not necessarily incompatible. Maybe 100%. There was a value, there's a purpose in that initial romance and that initial relationship because it's meant to teach you and the other person something about whatever the case is. And maybe it's also true. It's time to move on. Those could coexist.
Yeah, that's huge. And it's funny because we as humans often, we assume things. If God says, hey, it's time that you should be in a romantic relationship with this person. We assume, oh, great, so we can get married. And sometimes God is actually, it was for you to be able to, be a blessing to their life for this season. They really needed this. Or maybe you did, or maybe like you were saying, there's a mutual growth that needs to happen. And it's fun. Yeah, it's funny. I know I do it. God will tell me something. And so I assume and I try to infer because I don't want the short-term scope that God is offering. I want the long-term scope. And so I almost try to read into what God is telling me because of some level, and this may be getting a little sensitive, due to lack of trust on my part. Because I want to know more, because I think I deserve to know more. I don't want to trust just that he'll take care of me. Like I want to know and take care of it myself.
Yeah, but if we've received the script of our life, the end from the beginning, then it's just like, then we're depending on that and not the person, right? Like we're depending on whatever document he gave for us to kind of just follow through it, just go through the motions, rather than just like, all right, God, you've got a plan. You're controlling. I trust you. And I think that's actually just really beautiful about what Jacob does is like, hey, even though this one thing feels really weird and scary, like, okay, like I'll be there. And I just think it makes so much more sense because initially when I was reading this passage, I'm like, why does God need to reaffirm like, no, it's okay. You can go to Egypt. Like I would just think like Jacob's like, Joseph's there. He's alive. What? Like I'll be there tomorrow. And yet like he's still in the middle of maybe the best news he's ever heard in his life. Yeah. He's still running it past. All right, God, like what do you say about this?
Yeah. And something you said there is so key that instead of God giving us kind of like a document to give us the journey for the rest of our life, like he wants to be there every step of the way so that we can develop that relationship that Jacob has that we see here. And this is something that I thought of really clearly when I read this is it is so cool that at the very end of Jacob's life, even when like the biblical story has fully transitioned away from him, like God and him have still been developing a relationship and they have still been growing to this point where now when we come, like he doesn't even want to like you were saying, most people would have just jumped at the opportunity like, my son's here. I know that's the will of God for me to go see him. I'm heading out. And maybe that's great. But I think there's also a beauty in that Jacob's relationship with God had developed so much that he wasn't even willing to receive a quote unquote good thing without saying, hey, God, is this actually your will for my life? Yeah. Like, is this where you want me to be? And it's just so cool seeing that their relationship is developing at some level, you could say off camera. Yeah. Like not in the spotlight. And I think often I want my relationship with God to be developing in these huge ways where everyone's seeing it. It's making an impact on everyone. And this is going to be a story which impacts hundreds of people and it's all great. But sometimes I think maybe most of the time, God is actually developing my relationship with him in like isolation, in times where no one is seeing, no one is hearing, no one is being effective. But it's this time off camera where God is really getting to know me just in the same way that he got to know Jacob, even when Jacob's story was not the one that was in the limelight.
I think something that stands out to me is the way that Jacob's attention seems to be undivided, right? Like he's solely tunnel vision, at least the way that this narrative seems to be playing out. He's tunnel vision on what God's inviting him to do. And I think it's also cool that in the same way you're highlighting it, this is happening off camera. God is not divided in his attention. He actually has some weird capability that's so foreign to the male species, right? This multitasking thing where he can actually give 100% of his attention to Jacob, to Joseph, as well, as though they were the only story that was being written. Like he's there present at every moment. He's navigating all the evil that people meant for Joseph and turning it for good. He's still coming good on fulfilling the promises to Jacob, so much to the extent that like this is maybe not the most exciting word to hear, but he's like, I'm going to go with you to Egypt. I'll bring you back, but you're going to die in Egypt, but Joseph will be with you to close your eyes. Like he is so concerned. It seems like God is so concerned about the details that matter to Jacob and the details that matter to Joseph. God is keen on those things and he's able to do it both, whereas attention seems undivided to each individual.
Yeah, like there's this picture of God that he has 100% capacity to give me attention, even when he's giving 100% capacity to Joseph or to Justin or to whoever. And it's really cool to see, like, because sometimes I've felt that, God is working really mightily in this person's life or that person's life, and has felt like as God has been moving so much in their area or their ministry that it sometimes feels like, well, maybe I shouldn't even start something. Maybe I shouldn't even do something because God is working over there. But the crazy thing is that even though God's attention is 100% developing them, God is 100% with me and developing me. And this is where we can never get it twisted. God moving in one area means that he can 100% move in your area too. Like there's no division with God. He's everywhere all the time. And it gets kind of weird and trying to figure out how and what does that look like. But all I know is that it is what it is. Like this is something that I'm seeing so clearly in this story and in my life, is that God is 100% focused on me, even though he's 100% focused on you too.
And I think what's really cool is how there's no time limit to the faithfulness of God. And when he says something, when he declares he's focused it on you and he's worried about fulfilling his promise, like there's no amount of time that stops him from being faithful. This passage talks about how, he's going to return him back from Egypt, go back to his homeland. But if you fast forward through the story, that doesn't happen for quite a long time. It's like 400 years of eventual captivity in Egypt for the children of Israel. And yet, one of the things that's pointed out in the Exodus story is that no, they brought Jacob's bones back with him too. They brought him back home. Like God was still faithful after hundreds of years.
Yeah. And can you imagine getting to the point of a relationship and trusting in the faithfulness of God, where God literally comes to you and says, hey, it's cool to go down see your son. Just know if you do, you're going to die and it's all good. And you say, okay, I'll head out.
Cool. Yeah.
Like if God came to me right now and said, hey, Ben, during Christmas, I'm going to want you to go visit your family in Maryland. You'll die there, but it's going to be all right. I would probably freak out a little. I'd be like, why am I going to die? Flight. Can I not die? Is there any way to avoid this? What if I don't go? If I don't go, is it like all of these questions? But it seems like Jacob is just so content with the faithfulness of God that even in the face of God literally saying, you're about to die, he says, okay, I'll go where you've called. Like, I trust you and your faithfulness. Like, what a restful place to be.
Yeah, because we will easily say yes if there's a success, clause. Like, okay, do the thing, launch the ministry, go talk to the person, start the business, like move to that place. Like, okay, as long as I know that it's going to work out. And like a lot of times that's what God is saying is like, go move by faith, things will work out and it's going to be okay because I'm with you. But this moment, it's the exact opposite. Go and you're going to die.
Yeah.
It's like, all right, cool. Let's go. That sounds fun.
And
maybe this is a Jesus moment, right? Like this is a foreshadowing of Jesus. Go to the cross. You're going to die. I'm going to lay my own life down so that my children could be free.
Yeah. Yeah, it could be. And I just feel like I want to get, and maybe I'm on the journey and I think I am, but I want to get to that point where God could literally tell me the negative result of something he's calling me to do, and I'm still resting in his faithfulness and feel totally fine and comfortable going ahead and pushing forward. I mean, think about what if God was like, hey, Justin, I want you to start the move. 0 people are going to listen to it, and I need you to do it. Like,
well, in a real sense, that was kind of the condition. Like, I was like, all right, because I had no ambition that it would become a thing, the whole YouTube thing, that there would be like any real success. It was just, God, you're calling me to do it, so I'll do it. And it's interesting because this was one of the questions that has emerged over the years when people would interview about my story and yada, yada. One of the consistent questions is, how do you measure success? And I think what they want, what they're getting at is, X views or Y people messaging you or fill in the blank, like the engagement levels and the vanity metrics. And did you get your silver play button? Which I did, in fact, get my silver play button.
Which I did, by the way.
But my answer has always been the same. Like, I don't worry about that. The only metric that I care about is faithfulness. Like, if I believe God's called me to do a thing, that's the only thing that I worry about. And it's been to the extent where at multiple stages of that journey, being willing to throw everything away. Like, when I transitioned away from that Christian vlogger to the next thing, that was a massive risk because it was actually very successful of a show. And in a very real sense, the shows that I've done in the recent years since that Christian vlogger have been, from a numerical perspective, less meaningful, less valuable in the sense that like less people watch it.
Wow.
But something has happened. And this is how I understand it from my limited perspective. And God very well could be doing more or something different.
Yeah.
But I've done 4 or 5 different iterations of different shows. But what has emerged most recently, and because you were actually there just a couple of hours ago, we've launched a digital missionary academy where I'm able to take the experience of all these different things and now be able to package it in a way to give to others tools so that they can serve God on this kind of online ministry space. I wouldn't be able to do that if I was so protective over the success that I, quote unquote success that I had earlier. The willingness to throw it all away just because God said move. That's actually in no small part, I think, why I get to do what I'm doing right now and be able to serve, dozens of aspiring digital missionaries is because of those faithful moves.
Yeah. And it seems like in Jacob's journey, and I want to ask you a question at the end of this. It seems like in Jacob's journey, it was faith building all the way, and it wasn't like day one God was like, "Hey, go die."
Yeah.
But it seems like it was growth to the point where he comes to a place and he says, "If you're calling me, then I know that that's where I need to be." Has that been also your journey where you feel like God has actually been building your faith so that you got to a point when he asked you to do something really big, like, "Hey, remember the success I gave you? Toss that out and do something else." Like you were like, "Hey, if you gave it to me, I know you're going to do something great." Has that been your experience of like faith steps, faith journey?
Absolutely. I don't think that God ramps us up from 0 to 100 right away.
Yeah.
That there's a recognition of maybe the frailty of humanity. Maybe that's too grand of a way to look at it. But at least my own frailty and the weakness of my faith early on, that the invitations that he gave to me never were out of my capacity to step into. They might have felt big at the time, and they were big at the time. Like, I don't want to downplay that, but they were never impossible to do. God invited me to take the next step of faith, and then the next step of faith, and then the next step of faith. And when you take enough steps, it's amazing how far you can go. And I think that's the key, is that I think that's maybe what Jacob has learned through some trial and error, not always getting it right, but he learned, you know what, when God says, take a step, I'm going to take the next step.
Yeah. And another thing that's really cool that I see a parallel with your situation is that in Jacob responding in faithfulness to God's faithfulness, because I think that's something important, is that like our faithfulness is a response to his. Like we see that he is good and he's calling us, so then we have trust, right? And I think what's cool though is that Jacob's trust in the Lord and his leading has now led to his sons having trust in the Lord's leading. Like, where did Joseph learn it? Like, where did Judah learn it? All of these sons, like, they're learning from their father responding to God's faithfulness. And I think something that's really cool with your digital media ministry is that because you've stepped out in faith so many different places, now you are actually encouraging other people to do the exact same thing. Like all of these media students, like what they're doing is literally saying, God is calling me to do something. And you're saying, listen, this is how it happened for me. This is what it looks like to step out in faith. Now let's all make that journey together. And so your response to Jesus's faithfulness in your life is actually prompting other people to make a similar step. And I think that's a really cool thing about faith, is that it literally reproduces in other people.
Yeah, it reminds me of Romans 1:17, that the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith. And there's this idea of that when we act by faith, there's a contagious element to that causes others to be inspired in the same way and to move by faith. I receive the faith to take that step from the faithfulness of Jesus. And in no discounting way to what Jesus does, but all to highlight how God works through humanity, is that other people are often inspired. We are often inspired through the faithfulness of other people in our lives. And so I guess that's the thing. That's the take-home lesson, right? It's like sometimes God, quote unquote, contradicts himself. It's like, well, hold on. What happens if we just trust that he's got a master plan? And even if it doesn't make sense, and even if it feels like it was premature or different than your expectations, what does it look like to move by faith and to trust that the results are in his hands?